Cubs fans and people around baseball knew that when Theo Epstein was brought in to be the president of the Chicago Cubs to install the Theo Epstein way of doing business, that it was going to lead to some lean years, some more lean years at that, for my beloved Chicago Cubs. And there's no question that the Cubs organization was in a bad way before Theo was brought in, and there is no question that a full and complete rebuild from the farm system on up was needed and very necessary and years overdue. Now, we're currently in year 3 of that Theo project, of the Theo way, if you will. Next year, 2015, will be the real critical year, year 4 of that plan, where you really start to see whether or not this was the right direction or the wrong direction for the Chicago Cubs to ultimately go in. What we've seen over the past 2.5 years now, almost 3 years, is the Cubs' obsession with trading off pieces and getting young prospects, and in particular finding young players that the team can have control of for 6 to 7 seasons and potentially re-sign them several years before they're free agent eligible, so that way you can have them long term at a cheaper overall cost. Understanding what the price of doing business in the free agent market has become, that it can be incredibly prohibitive from trying to build your team via free agency alone. You have to have those young, inexpensive prospects because that talent ultimately comes to you longer and at a cheaper price. And there is no question about that. Now, there's also no question in my mind, as I've talked about before on this channel, that the reason that Theo Epstein was brought in and he brought in Jed Hoyer and they undertook this rebuilding plan was because the Ricketts family didn't have the most money in the war chest, so to speak, to be able to go out there and spend lavishly in free agency. They also did this with keeping in mind that they needed to splice $200 to $300 million off of payroll in the next 5 years from 2012 to 2016 in order in part to help fund the remodeling of that dump Wrigley Field. That's really the primary reason that Theo Epstein was brought in, was to buy time, not to buy time to build a winner. That's a byproduct, but he was really brought in to buy time and save money in order to be able to get the remodel of Wrigley Field underway. Now, what we've seen are some good, encouraging results, but obviously frustrating for Cubs fans like myself. You know, it's been since 1945 the last time the Cubs have played in a World Series, 1908 since they've won a World Series. You know, it gets frustrating to always hear, wait until next year. Well, there's been over 100 next years. When is next year going to be this year? But you see Starlin Castro being re-signed to a long-term, relatively affordable contract for a young, high-level all-star caliber shortstop like he is. You see Anthony Rizzo being acquired via trade from the San Diego Padres. You send off Andrew Cashner. You get back Anthony Rizzo. Now you've got a young, left-handed, power-hitting, middle-of-the-order first baseman that you now, because of being able to re-sign him, you know, you have him 4 years and you've eaten into some of the free agent years. You also see a Cubs organization that has amassed some of the best minor league talent in all of baseball, one of the premier farm systems in all of baseball, especially when it comes to impact hitters. You talk about in recent years, and a couple of these guys sure carry over from the Hendry regime, but you're talking about players like Bryant and Javier, Baez and Alberto Mora and Jorge Soler and Arismendy, Alcantara, and this year's first-round pick Kyle Schwarber, and there are others too, but a lot of potential big-time impact bats in the farm system. You look at some of the pitching prospects. The Cubs have gotten a little bit better as an organization over the past few years in terms of quality of pitching in the organization, in terms of C.J. Edwards and Pierce Johnson, Aroydis Vizcaíno, Paul Blackburn, Corey Black, Kyle Hendricks. What you see in general, though, is one of the best farm systems in baseball that Theo and Jed Hoyer have done a tremendous job of building for an organization that for many years had one of the most overrated and ineffective farm systems in Major League Baseball. You see a system that is heavy in impact bats, but a little bit light on the impact pitching, frankly. So I think it came to a surprise to a lot of people. Not so much that Jeff Samardzija and Jason Hamill were traded. We knew this was going to happen, and we knew it was going to happen before the July 31st trade deadline. We also knew that, the Cubs are in that mode where they were going to be sellers again, and this probably isn't going to be the last deal that they make before July 31st. But I think what surprised a lot of people is that the trade happened so early, on the 4th of July. I was taken a little bit aback by that. I thought it was going to happen a little bit closer to the deadline. And I think what surprised people in particular is the fact that the Cubs, didn't get a lot of pitching help out of this trade. They traded away two starting pitchers to the Oakland A's and got two young impact bats for their farm system and a pitcher in Dan Straley and a player to be named later, or cash considerations, maybe with them viewing Straley as a guy that they could do something similar with what they did with Jake Arrieta, for example. But I think a lot of people were surprised, for an organization that everybody recognized they have impact bats all over the place, but not a ton of pitching help. Even though their pitching situation is better than it was a couple of years ago, it's still not great. Why go get more bats and get so little pitching? Why do that? Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, the Cubs are building themselves for more financial flexibility for 2015 and beyond. This is an organization that after this season, they don't have to worry about paying Samardzija long term. They don't have to worry about Alfonso Soriano's contract at all. That's going off of the books. Carlos Villanueva is going to be off the books. There are several players off the books come next season, and the Cubs know that now in year 4, it's time to go a little bit heavier into the free agent market and being able to trade away a Samardzija and basically a one-year rental in Hamill and get quality impact minor league bats like Addison, Russell, and Billy McKinley means you've done very well for yourself, and you've also created yourself more flexibility, especially from a financial standpoint, heading into this offseason and beyond. You're also looking at a team here when everybody's saying, well, you've got Addison Russell, but you've already got Castro, you've got Alcantara, you've got Baez. Where the hell are you going to play all of these guys? Well, I think we have to understand that the Cubs know that their system is very heavy on the impact bats and very light on those power pitching prospects. There's going to be a trade that happens. The Cubs know that they are probably years away from getting any real help from their minor league system in terms of their rotation. And they might not have a front end rotation number 1 or number 2 arm throughout their entire system. They know that a starting rotation of Travis Wood and Edwin Jackson and Jake Arrieta, and then maybe in the 5th slot, a combination of either Kyle Hendricks or Dan Straley, is probably not going to get the job done. It's going to produce more similar results like you've had in 2012, 13, and 14. They know there's not an ace on this rotation. They know there's not an ace in this system. So they know Theo and Jed, the organization as a whole, they know that they're going to have to go out there and buy their ace or acquire their ace. Which brings me to David Price. When you look at David Price and you look at the way that the Cubs have been built so far, they've had an emphasis primarily based around getting young prospects to come up through your system and then being able to have control of them for the next 6 to 7 years, maybe 2 to 3 years in, you re-sign them and eat into a couple of their free agency years so that way you have them cheaper over a longer term. Well, David Price doesn't fit into that mold. Here's a guy that's only under contract through 2015. You would only have 1 year of team control before he goes into free agency. But what you do get with David Price is one of the very best number 1 starters in baseball. You're talking about one of the premier left-handed power pitchers in all of baseball. These type of guys don't come available on the trade market or in the free agent market all the time. And what I think Theo and Jed and the Cubs organization are doing is positioning themselves in a way where they are acquiring a surplus of talent in terms of hitters in their farm system, knowing that they lack in the pitching prospects to be able to make a deal happen, that they're going to have to be able to wow somebody to be able to pull off a trade for a frontline starting pitcher. Well, luckily for the Chicago Cubs, they might have the bats now available to be able to make a big, risky deal for a David Price, bring him in, re-sign him long-term again because of the financial flexibility you created yourself over the past few years to be able to do that. Give him $20+ million a year and not feel that bad about it. Give away 3 or 4 of your top 10 or 12 prospects and still not be hurting that bad as a farm system. I think the Cubs are incredibly well positioned right now, and I think beyond a shadow of a doubt, in my mind at least, are the clear front runners to be able to acquire David Price from the Tampa Bay Rays in this offseason. That's why they acquired, in my opinion, Addison Russell and Billy McKinley, because they could sit there and turn those two young bats around and flip them in a deal for David Price to the Rays. If you could put together a package of Addison Russell and Billy McKinley and maybe a Pierce Johnson and maybe you throw in another second-tier pitcher like a Kyle Hendricks or a Tony Zych, let's say, that might be enough to get the job done. And if you're from the Cubs standpoint, at some point in time, you're going to have to find a frontline pitcher. You're going to have to find a stud. You're going to have to find an all-star ace. That's something you didn't have with Samardzija, even though he made the All-Star team. He was never going to be an ace. Would I rather pay Samardzija $15 to $17 million a year, knowing I'm expecting him to be an ace when he is nothing more to me than a number 2 on a good team or a number 3 on a great team? Or would I rather pay $20 or $22 million a year while it's a starting pitcher, yes, to a pitcher that is an established, legit ace and one of the very best in baseball that may have some of his best years ahead of him in David Price? To me, that's what I would rather do. I would rather make the trade because basically what you're saying here, if I traded, let's say, Addison Russell, Billy McKinley, Pierce Johnson, and maybe another second-tier arm in your system to the Rays for a David Price, okay, a 4-for-1. You're talking about you basically traded Jeff Samardzija and Pierce Johnson and another guy to get David Price. Would you do that deal? You would do it in a fucking second. So while I still have my concerns about the Cubs' long-term vision and whether or not they are actually truly committed to building a World Series champion or just saving money for a kind of hamstrung Ricketts family from a financial standpoint, the bottom line is I like some of the things that Theo and the Cubs have been doing. And when you look at it from a free agent standpoint, when they've went the one-year rental route, whether it's a Scott Feldman or it's a Jason Hamill, they've done well. When they've went the free agent route and they've spent big-time money in free agents to guys like Edwin Jackson and Yuji Fujikawa, the results, not so good. So maybe going after not a second-tier player, but a top-tier player via trade and then being able as a condition of the deal to re-sign him long-term might be the elixir that the Cubs need to put them in at least wild card consideration for 2015. And as those other young bats, the Bryants and the Baezes and maybe the Alcantaras make their way to the roster in 2015, and guys like maybe Soler and Almora and maybe even Kyle Schwarber make their way to the lineup in 2016 at the big league level, you're talking about a team that with a David Price, with a Travis Wood, with a Jake Arrieta, with a guy like Edwin Jackson, with a young, impressive bullpen with guys like Hector Rondon and Neil Ramirez and Pedro Strop and Justin Grimm, and you're talking about a team that could potentially have some World Series visions. Let me dream. But I have to say, I like what Theo did here with this deal of Samardzija and Hamill. Go where you can get the most. If it's bats, it's bats. It doesn't always have to be pitching. You can take young, powerful, impact bats or great position players and turn them into frontline starting pitching. It happens, and it can happen, and I believe it will happen this offseason for the Chicago Cubs, as I think they will have the necessary pieces in place and the desire in place to make a big-time, earth-shattering move like trading for David Price and giving up a lot and still not hurting their organization in a trade with the Tampa Bay Rays.